Session 8, Integrated Campaigning, is the title of Integrated Campaigning again. Our presenters are Colonel Monk, again, who has already been introduced, and Commander Retired Dave Sears, who I mistakenly introduced before. Dave is the founder of and managing partner of Shundis Global Limited Liability Corporation. Jeremiah, will you start us off on this panel, please?
Absolutely, thank you, sir. So this is something of a continuing discussion from the last one, but more so getting into how we aim to achieve those that relative advantage in campaigning. So as far as how we have historically applied the military instrument of power in campaigning has been relatively uniform. We tend to build out plans and then apply the military instrument of power accordingly to achieve that objective. In integrated campaigning, you have to look more cross-dimensional and cross-objective, particularly with regard to the emergence opportunities. So it's not necessarily just integration across the various military capabilities, but it's integration with our partners and other departments, other governmental capabilities, really to achieve that relative advantage as we go forward. The key is looking at the complex nature of the environment in which we're working. And in a lot of cases, subordinating the military instrument of power to those larger national interests. The real catch is we tend to orient all military planning on that cumulative phase 3 type of warfare event. And we make the assumption that if we are prepared for that phase 3 event, everything else is easier and we don't have to prepare for it. Unfortunately, what that does is it tends to orient us on everything becoming preparation for war, which is something like, if anyone rides motorcycles out there in the audience, it's like looking at the pothole. If you stare at the pothole, you're going to hit the pothole. So you kind of want to look away from the pothole to avoid it in the first place. But this predominant focus on phase 3 continually orients us at that proverbial pothole at the expense of the rest of the road. And that's where we really need to look at the larger objectives often put down by the chief of mission or the chief of station, and figure out how to use the military instrument in support of those. That's really where SOF has a very interesting role, I think, as we don't necessarily have a huge role in the cumulative large force operations of that cumulative phase 3. Our role is predominantly in the proverbial phase 0, phase 1, even though that phasing construct is still oriented on the warfight. It's in that gray zone space of just normal day-to-day competition that we do every day, everywhere in the world. And how do we use SOF in that daily application to advance national interests, predominantly in support of our partners, allies, and other departments? And that's really where we need to start focusing the direction of our force application and our concept of what it means to campaign. Otherwise, we tend to gravitate back to the large magnetic pull of the DoD version of campaigning, which is preparation for warfare. And I think that's misleading, and it ends up skewing the environment. Back over to you, please, sir.
Thank you. Dave, comments?
Yeah, I was directed to kind of talk about some of how integrated campaigning can be conducted in the absence of command and control authority. And I think what happens is when you talk about integrated campaigning, it's actually not really something completely new. We have become reliant on these traditional structures, though, especially from the military perspective, that we have to have who has command and control, who's in charge, what are the hierarchies, and that works within our framework of the military. But as you get to integrated campaigning, as the M, you know, in the DIME acronym becomes a lowercase letter, and the other ones start to take a little more precedence, or it looks more like a Venn diagram, like it should, with all parts equally working together, integrated, then it becomes about cooperation. It becomes about co-creation, pieces like that that aren't necessarily formal structures. You have, when it functions in the correct way or in the most efficient way, you see it at that country team level. So that's a microcosm of how it can work across the national level, is that at a country team, you have a chief of mission who's either the ambassador, the chargé d'affaires, whatever title you're going to have. And he's surrounded by a team from each integrated element of national power. So you could have other State Department folks there, intelligence people, he's going to have economic people, USAID, and it depends on the structure of the country team, how big it is, and military elements. When that's working, he's using, you know, some formal authority, but no true command and control over those elements. What he's using is he's figuring out, or she's figuring out, who are the stakeholders in my environment. He's taking appreciation of the context and the system that he's functioning within. So you figure out who are the stakeholders, who has a share internally and externally, and how do we cooperate? How do we align our goals of what we're trying to achieve? And it becomes about informal alignment and informal leadership rather than formal leadership that has become so prevalent in the military and that we rely on so much. Especially, I think that there's a big fallback in command and control authority in the military with our ability to communicate immediately. We've sort of gotten rid of some of the informal mechanisms and the implied tasks or implied guidance. You know, as we move forward with integrated campaigning, it's really about continual communication, adaptation, and appreciation of the environment and who's in your environment. And we had great success with this on a project that I worked years ago at SOCOM. We didn't have any formal authority, you know, the group that I worked with, but what we did is we mapped the system of who are all the stakeholders on the blue, the friendly side internal to us, and who are all kind of the stakeholders, the actors on the adversarial side. And then we took the blue side to make it integrated campaigning. We figured out who were the players at State Department, who were the players at Treasury, who were the players at the intelligence, throughout the intelligence community. And we started to talk to them all, and we went to them and began to figure out where were they trying to go in respect to a problem set that we were working, and how can we align our goals. And we achieved a lot with very little authority and very little budget, you know, but we were able to align things and cooperate instead of just, I think sometimes there's a reliance on we're the, you know, soft, you know, in the counterterrorism fights, the big gorilla in the room. So we can push and help people rather than lead them in the directions that we want to go, or follow when it's necessary. So this integrated campaigning is going to be absolutely necessary as we move towards more and more complex challenges. And it's going to be absolutely necessary that we don't fall back on just formal structures, because they don't exist across the national security space. We need to work on communication. You need to work on cooperation, co-creation, and have a appreciation of where your partners are trying to go and how you can align with their objectives, align their objectives with yours as well. That's kind of how I view it. And this isn't something new. People have done this, you know, companies do this. They are able to be at the same time friend, foe, adversary, all at once across different levels. So integrated campaigning is the end result that we need to confront some of the complexity that's occurring today and the challenges that we face. Back to you.
So a question from the audience is concerns, what's the real difference between integrated campaigning and good old-fashioned interagency cooperation? It seems to, I guess, to this listener that we're conflating the two, or confusing the two, what is the difference? Jeremiah, we'll start with you.
Okay.
Dave, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It was yesterday. I don't know who was speaking to it, but I think there was, I can't quite remember, but he talked a little bit about sloganization. And so there is some aspect to integrated campaigning of sloganization. It's trying to get, yes, is there cooperation? But it's more than cooperation. That's a necessary element of integrated campaigning. But it's also, in addition to cooperation, it's co-creation. It's both of you or multiple entities working towards and aligning your goals together. So cooperation is just you help me and I help you. It takes other elements as well. It's an appreciation of where your partners are trying to go, and you all going towards a shared sort of vision, a shared appreciation of the problem space or the challenge space that you're in. That's important to begin this idea of integrated campaigning. You all sort of appreciate the problem or the challenge in similar ways. And then you can start to align, cooperate to get there, but co-create, approaches to the challenges ahead. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I absolutely agree with that. And just to put it slightly different terms, I think it's a matter of where you start and who the lead actor is, really. So in campaign planning, the military is the lead actor, and there's a definitive command and control structure, and we kind of expect everyone else to come along with us. While as integrated campaigning puts the needs of other actors first and is a lot more fluid, and the military acts in a supporting role. Unfortunately, we tend to get those two mixed up, and as Jim Miss put pretty well last panel, we tend to be given the nail and told to hammer it, when in reality, in a lot of cases, what happens is we end up calling everything a nail, in which case it's not, and then trying to hit it with the hammer. Integrated campaigning looks at what tools are actually needed, and then we bring those resources to that to support that objective accordingly with what the situation actually is. Over.
So another question from the audience: Is there a role for the National Security Council staff and the National Security Advisor in integrated campaigning, or is this primarily a DoD function that elicits cooperation from other agencies, other cabinet officers?
I would say yes, although it depends on the particular National Security Council. Of course, with every administration, the level of involvement and proactivity of the NSC ebbs and flows. In theory, the way it was created was to be that clearinghouse across the departments to figure out how to achieve national objectives, national interests across all the tools of government. Some administrations have used that very proactively and effectively, almost sometimes too much, and some have not, and it has become essentially more so just policy management. So it depends on the NSC, but I think in theory, yes. This gets back to that question of objectives, and if we expect the NSC to set objectives and then develop tasks, applying that military mindset of planning to integrated campaigning, we're going to be constantly disappointed. Instead, it's the NSC's job to give us the compass heading and help us figure out the way ahead. And in integrated campaigning, again, as an infinite type of environment, we're not going to get a definitive objective. We're going to get a vector or general policy guidelines, and we have to figure out how to achieve that relative advantage or maintain those interests accordingly. Dave?
Yeah, so I think Jeremiah said that the NSC, the structure of the NSC is important. The NSC can largely be dominated by DoD. So the question, is it DoD, when we think about integrated campaigning, first I think of integrated campaigning as a verb, not a noun. Campaign's a noun. And that goes back to sort of this joint concept for integrated campaigning was written. I mean, that's one of the principal tenets of it. It's a continual activity that occurs, but across the national security space. And when we keep thinking of how is the military or DoD's role a primary role, we may not have a primary role. We have to sort of let go of our identity and join the identity of a national security identity writ large to go forward with a true integrated campaign. And I think that for integrated campaigning to actually occur are structures. So if we think about this in terms of a systems perspective, the structures that we have are not friendly towards integrated campaigning. The idea of the Goldwater Nichols, the idea of the National Security Act of whatever it is, 47, that we go back to, these structures, they inhibit our abilities to do integrated campaigning. The makeup of the NSC and who has the money to fund those the positions in there, which is DoD, inhibits our ability to do integrated campaigning. It's DoD almost has to take the role of kind of the idea of saying the idea of servant leadership to the rest of the national security apparatus, which is moving farther and farther away from the M being a capital M in the dime sort of piece. And I know that fallacies with dime and all that, so don't get too wrapped around that. But we need to be subservient to those other elements of national power that have a lot bigger place in today's challenges in today's world. Over.
We have 3 questions from the audience, and one I'm going to ask you, but I want you to sort of think about it. We may actually end with it. And then I have 2 shorter questions. So the longer question is, from each of you, perhaps an example of where a traditional campaign plan went awry. Can you point to an example of where a traditional campaign plan was not effective, where an integrated campaign plan would have been more effective? We'll give you some time to think about that one. And the 2, there's 2 shorter questions here. And the first one is, would end states of the GPC really align to decision points where we can reassess and adjust our approach to follow on end state? And that implies to me that that's the long game, or it's the sort of an infinite game. So Jeremiah, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see, I can take this in several different directions. I think first it's worth understanding kind of the ontology of how the military approaches problem sets. We have this this religion of ends, ways, means, which is really kind of an artificial and a fairly new concept of how we approach problem sets. But it's codified, of course, in doctrine as JOP, the Joint Operational Planning Process, and right there in the name is an indication of what it's built for: operations plans. But the ends, ways, means construct itself is really not that old. It's developed by Arthur Lickey in a War College paper in 1989, quoting General Taylor from Vietnam. as an easy way to do operational planning. Unfortunately, we don't have a doctrine of how to do strategic planning. So therefore, we tend to take the operational planning model and apply it to strategy and pursue end states without thinking critically about whether they even exist or not. So what's in environments, complex environments like Dr. Snowden lay out in the Canavan framework, we need different models of how to approach these kind of complex problem sets. And one particular model was that I personally like is scenario planning, developed by two gentlemen who used to work with Shell Oil in the 1970s. What is his name? Schwartz, Peter Schwartz, I think his name is. Yeah, Peter Schwartz. Where you look at potential changes in the environment and then trying to determine what the scenarios could look like and then build yourself to be resilient to adapt to those scenarios. And you look at which ones are most probable and which ones are outside the realm, but potentially most dangerous. And you have to be able to adapt to all of those, which requires identifying where you are in the march to get to those potential scenarios. So think in terms of COVID 2 years ago. That would have been a scenario you could have planned for and then looked at key indicators along the way to determine if we're heading down the road of that particular scenario, which gets back to the original question. Replacing end states with decision points is I think it's an acceptable way to look at a model to do that. So maybe not necessarily decision points, which implies correcting a singular vector, but looking at more like milestones as time goes on and comparing those to your various scenarios and then adjusting your scenarios accordingly to meet your current understanding of the environment. And that's why in competition, it's so critical to develop understanding and continually reassess instead of just tying yourself to an objective and ignoring the changes in the environment around you. Dave, over to you.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a huge, I understand Jeremiah just gave you the sort of the history of end states and Leitke and the three stools of strategy and all those. I'm not a big fan of end states in the integrated campaigning aspect in terms, because I view integrated campaigning as something that's happening, again, in a longer term strategic sense. And it's continual reassessment and evaluation of where you're at. So vice end states or decision points, I look at it as more of azimuth checks. Are we still, based on where we want to go, are we still going on the correct vector direction at the correct speed to get to where we think we want to go? So we're kind of doing a little, think of it as a sailing metaphor. You don't go directly. The end state implies that I have this linear way to get to a point, and then when I reach that point, I'm done. Well, that doesn't exist in integrated campaigning in the complex world. By interacting with it, you're creating additional problems and you're changing the system just by interacting with the system. So you have to check, do kind of take a look at your compass. Where are we at? What direction are we still heading? Is that still the direction I want to go? So instead of end states, you kind of have these azimuth checkpoints where, hey, appreciate the environment, reassess. Is that where, are we headed in the right direction? Or do we still want to be even going in this direction? The end states work at a different level of sort of analysis. If I go down to a tactical environment, I can get more towards end states or a state that I want the system to be in a very discrete sense. In a finite game, you can have the end state. I think in an infinite game, you have these azimuth checks or milestones or pieces. Milestone still implies to me a little bit of a linear piece, just a verbiage thing, but I like the idea of it's nonlinear. So we're constantly assessing the environment in the infinite game. which is where integrated campaigning is going to serve us the greatest.
So what you're describing now seems to me to be somewhat similar to branches and sequels in traditional planning. Would you agree with that, or am I off base?
No, I don't think it's the same as branches and sequels. I think that branches and sequels are deviations from your initial line. With new changes, your initial line may be completely wrong on one of your azimuth checks. So if the situation changes, you might need to erase your entire line and set a new course. Branches and sequels implies that we stay on sort of that same course, and these are just how do we react to events within the line that we're on. So in the nonlinear sort of idea, if the environment changes such that, let's say, some guy gets elected leader for life in another country, you have to reassess the azimuth that you're on and the line. There's no branch and sequel to that. The game has changed. You're still in this larger infinite game, but the line you're on may no longer be valuable and may not be the right line. Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Well, what are your branches and sequels? Erase your line. Stop trying to stay on that continual line you're on. Reevaluate where you're at and decide, do you need to chart a new course? Hope that explains it.
Yeah, let me jump in there. I agree with that. I think the difference is branches are still aimed at that prescribed end state. And the goal of a branch is ultimately to get back to that objective. So it's really a deviation. I have yet to see a sequel, honestly, in any plan, because we plan to the end state and then we stop. So, and then as Dave pointed out, we don't look at reevaluating the end state. We reevaluate our progress towards that end state. We never go back and relook at a plan. The branch and sequel becomes an appendix that kind of never gets reviewed as the environment changes. So back to your first question, sir, on campaigning and such. I think Afghanistan's a pretty good example. We went into Afghanistan originally with 10th group or 5th group went in order to find those individuals responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And somehow that turned into rebuilding the Afghan government after we dropped 10th Mountain there. So we've been, as a result of that, trying to rebuild the Afghan government in our own image ever since. And we haven't reevaluated that end state of maybe this isn't an achievable objective. So think of that in terms of some of our existing contingency plans out there, and think about the framing that we've used to build them, which really exists for purposes not of achieving the end state, but achieving resources to get to that end state. And if we approach complex problem sets with that in mind, we tend to ignore the branches, but more so ignore the potential changes in the environment that undermine the entire premise of that plan to begin with. And we don't look past the particular end state because we tend to stop at that point. Over.
Dave, do you have an example of where an integrated plan would have been superior to a general plan, a concrete example to share?
Yeah, sure. I think Afghanistan is absolutely great example, and that's different failures in multiple areas. But let's take the war on drugs. So I worked Colombia for a long time, and there were siloed pieces of different elements of our national security apparatus, each working their piece. There was cooperation at levels, but there was no true integrated campaigning going on and all working together. It was more ad hoc, and there was a developmental piece that was occurring that wasn't, you know, necessarily aligned with the military piece that was occurring, that was aligned with the engagement or the intelligence assistance piece. So there was a whole bunch of discrete campaigns or plans, but they were never really truly integrated across the space. And I'd argue that you're still losing, and then go back to the domestic piece. That was just internal to Colombia, but go back to the domestic piece. I'd argue you're still losing sort of the war on drugs because it's not truly an integrated campaign across the entire national security apparatus.
Okay, good.
Can I jump in on that one real quick, sir? So
Sure.
I think Colombia is actually a fantastic example of what right could look like. And I know some people are going to disagree with that, but you know, we initially went into Colombia based on the war on drugs and the cartels and such. But we did not go in with the express purpose of building a quality security exporting force that's able to rescue American hostages 30 years later. But that's what we ended up building as a result of this. Because of our continued presence and continued engagement, it allowed, or what we did allowed for the eventual construction of a security apparatus that allowed us to rescue Keith Stanzel and the other two hostages in Operation Jacket. But that was an emergent piece that came out of a successful integrated campaign. Plus, Colombia is now the security exporter in South America. But we didn't go in with that express purpose. And that's where you have to look for the opportunities and those next emergent steps as you go through integrated campaigning, instead of pinning yourself to an end state that is unforecastable at that time. Thank you.
Another question from the audience. How might we think about corporations and non-governmental organizations in integrated campaigning? They are major actors playing in the same space as we heard yesterday. Your thoughts, Jeremiah, first.
Thank you. So I'll take this from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP has control and leverage over private corporations or state-owned corporations. So they can use them as instruments of national power, as we're seeing through Huawei networks and port constructions and things like that. Our system, of course, is different, and we have no control leverage. We create opportunities for corporations and then work with them through State Department, Commerce, Department of Commerce type of engagements with foreign countries and such. So it's a totally different aspect. They are instruments of national power, however, but they are uncontrolled. So if our objective is to secure national influence, we should do things to open doors for American corporations. And in a lot of cases, pulling that back to soft, it's setting groundwork. So it's building trust, it's building influence with the governments, which allows that toehold for commerce, for state, to make some of those inroads for American corporations. At the same time, once those corporations are there, they provide more access and influence that government can use for purposes of competing in terms of influence, advantage, and leverage. So yes, they're absolutely a part, but we have to get past this mindset of planning. You can't plan for it. You have to set conditions for it, and then look at how the environment develops, take advantage of the solutions, and continually try to re-vector instead of achieve.
Dave?
Let me take it from a little bit different perspective. I think corporations, let's say businesses, we can use them as a model to learn from on how to do integrated campaigning. So they have multiple roles, but I just got out of a separate session and had some very interesting conversations with guys that are in the emerging market space and have learned how to do essentially integrated campaigning. The business world understands it. They understand that they can be multiple things at once. They can be cooperating, competing, and adversarial all at the same time in different spaces. Microsoft can compete with Apple at the same time that it's cooperating with Apple on other science and logistics chains or different pieces like that. So we can take examples from the corporate world and see how integrated campaigning works in the wild. And we can use some of those lessons on how they've structured and how they've broken down silos. You've had this transition to this integrated marketing campaigning. I mean, that's what it's called, integrated marketing campaigning. And they integrate the marketing departments with the sales department, with the operations department to ensure that they're not functioning in silos. Now, there is some compellence that they can have, but it's not necessary. They get cooperation and they align their goals together, and they provide us a pretty good example for how to do integrated campaigning. On the other side of it, not just can we learn and use some businesses as models, but we can also use them to advance in practice, our integrated campaigning. I would argue that some of those systems we can put in structures in place, meaning you can take military people, should they do, I don't know, take your 4-year point, your 6-year point, and you go do 2 years in ExxonMobil or in an emerging markets firm, and you learn how to appreciate the environment that you're in, and you sit there for 2 to 4 years. You're internal to it, not a liaison. You know, I think we need to get away from liaisons are good, but we need to integrate into the other elements of national power. The Chinese, you know, I was told in the last session, the Chinese do this. They send their officers through different political entities. They send them through business entities. So they get experience in all these across the board different domains that they bring back to the military. And so they've made connections. We can use business to that same end and corporations to that same end if you integrate our people in them, because businesses are part of integrated campaigning and part of the national security structure, without a doubt.
So tomorrow, you are both given the assignment to write the joint integrated planning doctrinal manual. Where do you start? Tell us what it might look like, and give us just an overview of what might be incorporated in that manual that is not already in doctrine. And that is a terrible question. It's not from the panel, it's from me, and it's not from the audience, it's from me. And you can shoot me later for asking that. But I would like your opinions. Jeremiah, you're first.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to give an equally vague answer. I would say step one is go talk to the ambassador and the chief of station. And just ask them, hey, where do you think the environment is going? Not what do you want to do or what do you want to achieve, but where is the environment going? What's the vector? And then try to find ways to help. Far too often, we as military members go in with either the question of what do you want to do or what can we do for you? Which the latter is better, but or what do you what do you want to achieve is really the wrong way to approach this. It should be how can we shape things, and then what can we bring to the fight? But we have to subordinate ourselves, our instrument of power, to those others to achieve environments that are more beneficial to American interests. So if I'm writing that pamphlet, I would start with understand the other actors, understand the environment, understand the vector of where those actors think it should go, and then find creative ways to promote those type of objectives. That it can't start with planning, and it can't start with identify military objectives. Dave?
Okay, Dave?
Yeah, I wouldn't do it. I would not have the word doctrine, and I wouldn't have a manual. I think that those are counter to the idea of integrated campaigning. I would take you have the joint concept for integrated campaigning. I think the idea of a concept more fits the idea of integrated campaigning. It's not, there is no step-by-step process that is, step one is appreciate the environment. Step two is this. Step three is this. That's not how integrated campaigning works because of the need for cooperation, for co-creation, for alignment, for appreciation of the context, for a constant changing, navigating a constant changing landscape. You can't have step-by-step, and we really, really want that, especially in the military, especially in bureaucratic organization pieces. We like to have certainty. We like to have a manual. The idea of a manual is you can follow a manual. I can follow a manual to pack a parachute, and I can get a repetitive result. That's a simple problem space or a complicated problem space, not a complex problem space. In a complex problem space, there's no manual. You can give tools and introduce tools to help you learn how to navigate. You know, I'll go back to my sailing sort of metaphor. You can have a manual that teaches you how to maintain your boat and how to make upgrades, how to fix the engine. But when you put all the pieces together and you start navigating the seas, there's some guidelines, there's concepts that you follow and tools that you use, but there's no step A, B, and C. So I would, really, I think there's a document that exists that's pretty good to start with, is that joint concept for integrated campaigning. It's a concept document that then, depending on where you are in the environment, how you're going to apply that depends on where you sit in the system. So I would try to avoid things like doctrine and manual. You could sort of get away with doctrine, I guess, to some extent, but I would try to avoid it because of some stigmas that are attached to doctrine.
No, I tend to agree with both panelists. It seems to me there's no template for integrated planning, but consider yourself a planner and you're responsible for integrated planning. So what sort of skill sets does this planner require? Jeremiah?
Thanks, sir. So, just one quick note on the previous, and I really like the way Dave laid that out. Going back to the Canavan framework of Snowden, in the complicated realm, he prescribes the methodology to approach problem sets to sense, analyze, and respond, essentially applying best practices, which that's what doctrine is. Checklists. Checklists would be for simple problems, but in a complicated, it'd be best practices and methodologies. In the complex realm, he prescribes probe, sense, respond, which is you have to continually evaluate what's going on, quickly figure it out and adjust, which gets more into like Boyd's OODA loop. So in answer to your question, General Howard, the skill set you need is to be able to identify the environment in which you're working. But in integrated campaigning, you're predominantly in that complex realm. You're dealing with wicked problems, no solutions, or a variety of potential options, some good, some less good. You have to continually evaluate where you are and what those options are, probing, sensing, and then orienting and acting and responding accordingly, but then looking at the results of your, or the ramifications of your action and seeing how it changed the environment to be able to adapt and adjust accordingly. So the skill set you need, frankly, is somebody who doesn't believe in the doctrine, who maybe understands what doctrine is, but doesn't feel confined by it. And that's really hard in the military planning community that teaches adherence to procedure. Well, really the military community in general. So you need to kind of abandon the tools that we have, still understand them and use them when they're appropriate, but be able to use different tools and different methods when the environment calls for it. Dave?
Yeah, I agree with Jeremiah, is that it's not that the tools that we have are bad. It's which environments do you apply them to? And so there are skills in planning that are absolutely necessary for certain complicated problems. But as we get to this integrated campaigning that we're framing as a complex problem, I think that it's very hard to get the right people to do this. You have to have people that are questioning by nature, a bit nonconformist by nature, which doesn't lead to promotions, doesn't lead to upward mobility in our system. And so you're looking for the people that are a bit of the mavericks, which our system rewards less and less of. We actually disincentivize in the military the ability to think outside of the box, whatever you want to call it. You know, that's to think critically, creatively, to question. We disincentivize that. We reward and we incentivize getting along. We reward that behavior. And so it's very difficult to find the right people. You need to have somebody who's extremely intellectually curious, somebody who's broad in range, that has an expansive breadth of knowledge, but not necessarily super deep. So an interest in all sorts of things. You're looking for the polymath type person that is intellectually curious, has a humility, and is willing to supersede their identity to the group that they're trying to integrate. And there's a certain confidence you need to find. It's very difficult to place people in these positions. Very, very difficult. And it's the most important factor that we ignore often. You know, I think I can't quite read the truths behind you there, but one of them has to do with humans being the most important thing, if I recall correctly. And yet we tend to ignore that, and we want to act as if the humans that we have doing this are plug and play. And I can just take any lieutenant, captain, major, colonel, admiral, general, and put them in a position they're going to be able to do this. It's just not true. It's a very personalized endeavor, and you have to, it will be true if we begin our education system and we start educating more on this sort of philosophy, if we start to break down the cultural pieces that we have and embrace an idea of confronting complexity. But right now our culture, and it's changing, and we're trying to change that, and JSOU is doing things to try and change that, and encourage a culture of questioning, a culture of non-doctrinal manual following, a culture that's embracing complexity and saying, hey, some of the tools that we have are not sufficient. So, you know, the answer is those are the skill sets you need. It's very difficult to find the combination of those skill sets in one individual. It can be extremely challenging.
So I asked that question for selfish reasons. Let me see if I can paraphrase what you've both said. Seems to me that special operators would have a competitive advantage in the integrated campaigning arena. Seems to me that nonlinear thinkers would have a competitive advantage in what you're advocating in integrated campaigning. As far as thinking out of the box thinking, actually, I'm getting sold. I can't find the box sometimes, but I agree totally with what you're saying. So I also did this, and I'm glad that, Dave, you gave a plug to JSOU, because I think the type of education that's provided here is important for the integrated campaigning of the future. So thank you. We are 7 minutes to go. We've gotten a lot of value out of both of our speakers. For me, I've learned quite a bit about there's a wedding and marriage. I don't know, it's a metaphor or analogy. There's a pothole. I think that's an analogy, and there's a sailing metaphor. So if you do public speaking like I do, I can use all of these, I hope. But if you can entertain at least one more question, we'd like to give you at least one more. Is that okay with our panelists? Thumbs up? Good. So getting back to the interagency, NSC, and how do we build trust? This is from the audience. How do we build trust among interagency players in integrated campaigning going forward, in the infinite game model of trust among teams in an organization? And I think that's a little bit like something that you've both hit on, but if you would take that one, you'd make one of our audience members very happy. So Dave, you first.
Yeah, building trust is absolutely essential and a very difficult thing to do. It is about the relationships and the personal relationships. You cannot find trust built in a manual. So what we would see a lot is, I saw pieces, you know, when I tried to work with the intelligence agency and had great success, there was counterparts that I had that went by the hierarchy. They followed the line and block diagram, and they were given authority and a position, and that was all formal. Trust is built, I think, in the informal system, and it's about following your word. You know, you build relationships, you have conversations that are outside of the formal hierarchy, and you figure out where the other people are going, and you align yourself with them. Figure out what the other organization, what the individuals in that organization are trying to do. You're not trying to build trust with an organization. You're trying to build trust with individuals and build relationships with individuals. And so and it takes time, and it takes honest and open communication, and that it takes, so putting a liaison, and let's take, for example, putting a liaison into the CIA or into the NSA or into Department of State, CT, whatever it may be, and you put them there for 2 months and then they leave. That's not a trust building exercise. They're not part of the system. They're not in it. So even if I had a relationship, I wasn't embedded, but I was engaged over years to build these relationships. So meaning I followed up on engagements every month, every week. Who have I talked to? Who have I not? Make sure that I talk to them. Do I go out to lunch? Do we have them over? Do we give them a brief? Is it necessary? So you're constantly working to build the relationship and trust. And you have to empower your people forward to build that relationship and build that trust. So if you're a senior leader, you need to let them build that and make sure that you're not doing anything to undermine that trust as well. Be cognizant of it, that it's occurring at multiple levels. So go ahead, Jeremiah.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Just to just to kind of say all that in a different way, because I absolutely agree. Trust is relationship. It's continued performance over time. And to build that relationship, the critical piece is working on behalf of somebody else's interests in a lot of cases. So you can't just always expect it to be a one-way type of relationship. And it's particularly in integrated campaigning, it's understanding the other party's positions and objectives and interests, and working together to achieve those consistently over time. And that's why I think where SOF has a real significant value to add in great power competition. So our objective is not to go in and do large-scale combat operations. Our objective is to go in and build relationships, Columbia, in order to provide opportunities down the road. So continual engagement over long periods of time, building individual relationships, team relationships, governmental relationships, ultimately provides the ability for the nation to have those opportunities down the road when they become emergent.
We have time for one more question, which I'll get to in a second. Gentlemen, I hope you don't think that some of my probing questions are trying to sharpshoot you. I agree totally with what you have both said, and I'm just trying to elicit that for our audience, okay? That's so my final question is, if there is a sweet spot in your presentation today that we should all remember, what would it be? Jeremiah, you're first, and you have a minute.
I like my pothole analogy for, that's me. I use that one a lot. But I mean, that's the case. We spend so much time in military planning and military circles staring at the pothole, staring at warfighting. We ignore everything else. And everything else is not necessarily lead up to the pothole. Everything else is not a branch plan. It's the real world. We compete every day when we get out of bed. We don't fight large-scale combat operations every day. That's a branch plan. So our planning is backwards. We do a terrible job planning for the real world at the expense of the hypothetical world. And as we go into this realm of great power competition, integrated campaigning, we need to flip-flop our priorities. Dave.
Yeah, I'd say take away that integrated campaigning is not linear. There is not a manual. It is a complex, you're trying to navigate a complex space, a complex, challenging space, and you can develop principles, you can develop tools to confront that space or to navigate that space, but you cannot solve that space with the tools that we're kind of currently using in a linear manner. There is no prescription or set recipe to get you there. It's constantly evolving. I forget who it was. There's an academic out there who referred this to as a dancing landscape, meaning that you're trying to navigate and the landscape is constantly changing under you. So it's popping up new hills, new valleys are constantly moving as you're moving through it. So linear tools are not going to work. We need to put down some of the tools that we have, just put them in the locker, use them when they're appropriate, and learn some new tools to try and navigate and accept uncertainty and navigate uncertainty, not control it.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ending right on time. Jeremiah, good to see you again, sir. And music to my ears, gents. Thank you so much.